Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Cape Falcon Kayak, and in today's video we're going to do a detailed review of the canoe that we just finished testing down in Mexico as part of a larger test of our new skin-on-frame pedal drive outrigger canoe system. Now, as always, if you don't know what I'm talking about with the pedal drive canoe, make sure you check the link on the screen right now. That's going to take you to a video that talks all about the design history of this particular watercraft. And if you don't know who I am, because you're new here, once again, my name is Brian. I've been building skin-on-frame boats for over 20 years. I offer online video courses and plan sets for how to build skin-on-frame kayaks and canoes. So before we get into this, I just want to let you know that this is part one of a three-part series. I split this into three parts because this particular boat can be used as a normal canoe, it can be used as a pedal drive canoe, and it can also be used as an outrigger canoe, and that is way too much information to cover all at once. And also, not everyone's going to be interested in the pedal drive or the outrigger part of this system. So in this video, we're just going to be talking about the canoe itself. Keep in mind, our canoes can be built in a variety of different sizes and have a lot more features than you're going to see in this video. So for a complete overview, I'm going to put up another link on the screen right now that's going to take you to the overview of our skin-on-frame canoe building system. All right, so starting out with the trip that we just finished, basically I needed a testing ground for the new pedal drive system that would let me put in as many hours as possible in the shortest amount of time. And the best way to do that was just to throw the canoe up on the Jeep, drive it down to Baja, and then we could resupply in the cities and then drive to a beach somewhere, camp for a week, and use the boat in a variety of different conditions. Overall, we were down there for about 4.5 months, which works out to about 90 canoe trips, totaling about 250 hours on the water. During this time, we were deliberately hard on the boat because in addition to the performance testing, I also wanted to create an example to show people how much wear you can expect on one of our canoes under similar circumstances. Now, for the canoe itself, I built a small tandem that could also be used as a large solo, which is kind of unusual for me because I generally feel that when you try to make a canoe do both of those jobs, it just ends up doing both of them poorly. However, in this case, that is exactly what I wanted because for the purposes of testing new systems, oftentimes you're not going to see any potential weaknesses until you get to the edge case scenarios, such as an overloaded tandem or an underloaded solo. So I'm going to talk a lot more about the performance during the wrap up at the end of this video. But for right now, why don't we come in a little bit closer and check out this canoe. All right, so just starting out with some basic specifications. This canoe is 15 foot 6 inches long. It's 33 inches wide in the middle. It's 12.5 inches deep in the middle, and it has a little bit of tumble home. And like I mentioned in the introduction, the reason I chose these dimensions is because I wanted to have a canoe that I could use as a tandem and also as a solo, although neither of those things really optimally. Now, the overall weight of this boat in canoe mode, that means no rudder, no pedal drive box, backrest taken off and everything, is 47 pounds. And with everything added to turn this into a pedal drive canoe, it ends up being about 62 pounds. And then if we decide to add the outrigger, it ends up being more like 80 pounds. But today, we're just going to be talking about how this works in canoe mode. Now, for the materials on this boat, we used clear white oak for the ribs because it's extremely rot resistant, it's very strong, and it's very easy to steam bend. For the stringers and also for the gunnels, I used Western red cedar, and the reason I chose Western red cedar is simply because I have injuries and this is the lightest wood that is strong enough to work for this type of canoe. If you want the boat to be a little bit tougher, you could always build it out of spruce or pine, but you're definitely going to pay a weight penalty. Now, tying both of these things together is this heavy, flat, artificial sinew. Basically, this is a waxed polyester, and I actually took advantage of this trip to do a pretty serious durability test on this, where on one end of the canoe, we covered the floor with a mat, and on the other end, we just walked all over it. And so a little bit later on in the video, I'm going to show you the results of that test. Now, for the covering on this canoe, we used a 9-ounce ballistic nylon fabric saturated with 4 layers of 2-part polyurethane and 2 extra layers along the bottom. And the coloring here is earth pigment that's mixed directly into the polyurethane, which is vastly more color fast than the older acid dye system that we used to use. Also, I think it helps the skin to last longer because the particles are blocking the UV radiation from the deeper layers of the coating. Now, this is basically just my standard skin boat recipe at this point, and the reason I choose ballistic nylon and 2-part polyurethane is because they're both really flexible, which makes this both abrasion resistant but also extremely resistant to impact and puncture. Now up here you can see I've got a rub rail that's made out of cherry. You can do this out of any other type of hardwood. I just personally like working with cherry, and it's coated with 5 layers of the total boat water-based polyurethane, and then it's screwed to the gunnels with some number 6 stainless steel screws. Now, the seats on this boat are pretty fancy because they were meant to be used with the pedal drive, but if you didn't have a pedal drive in this canoe, you wouldn't have the backrest, you wouldn't have the underseat tiller, and you honestly wouldn't even have to make your own seat because there's plenty of very cheap and perfectly good canoe seats that you can order online and bolt into one of my skin-on frame canoes. So this particular seat just happens to be a drop seat. It's laminated into a curve to drop the center of gravity a little bit lower, a little bit wider than a normal canoe seat. It's got the tall back on it so you can push against it when you're pedaling, and it's got the underseat tiller for the rudder system. I'm going to be covering all this stuff in the next video, which is why I didn't take all this stuff off right now because I don't want to set it back up. So if you're thinking about this just as a normal canoe, just imagine the seat and don't think about any of this other stuff. Now, before I show you the bottom, I forgot to talk about the end protection on this particular canoe. So for this boat, I chose 3/8 inch wide brass half oval, and this is just one of a variety of options there. It's much easier to do this with plastic, but brass does have better abrasion protection, even though it is a little bit heavier. I actually prefer 1/2 inch wide brass, but that was going to add a little bit too much weight to this particular boat, so I went with the 3/8. And just to give you an idea of how much abrasion the bottom of this boat got, if we come in really close on one of these stainless steel fasteners, you can see that this is completely rounded over. And the reason for that is I didn't countersink this brass quite deep enough, so I had the edges of this screw exposed, but over 4 months of just raking back and forth across rocks and sand, it basically rounded over that stainless steel, which is not a soft metal, unlike the brass. So obviously stem bands are going to be great for crashing into things, and they do give you abrasion protection towards the ends of the canoe, but they don't really do anything to protect the middle section. And before I bring you guys in real close and show you what this looks like, I just want to be really clear about what we did and didn't do with this boat. So almost every time I was moving it, I had all of the pedal drive stuff attached and also the outrigger stuff attached, plus some gear. So this thing was probably pushing about 80 pounds. And we would drag it up and down beaches that were made of sand. We drug it up and down beaches that were made of pebbles. And if a beach was mostly sand and pebbles, but it also had a few larger abrasive rocks mixed into it, I would usually drag it over that as well. But once you got to where it was just all really jagged, sharp rocks, in that case, we would pick it up and carry it. So what I'm going to show you here is actually pretty impressive, but just keep in mind that just like any material, this stuff is not impenetrable. And if you really abuse it, you're going to start to damage it, although actually puncturing it is actually quite difficult. So why don't I just grab the camera here, and we're going to come in nice and close along the keel. And the reason we're focusing on the keel is because anywhere you have a hard backing on a skin boat, that's where you're likely to see the most wear, and the keel is more likely to wear than anything else. So coming along the keel here, if we come towards the center of the boat, this seems to be one of the worst spots right here, but these are all just surface scratches. These are not penetrating into the coating at all, and I'm definitely not seeing any exposed fabric. As we come back a little further here, you can see the hole for the pedal drive. Obviously, if you didn't have a pedal drive canoe, you wouldn't have this hole in the middle of the boat. And even though this is backed by plywood all through here, once again, we're not seeing much except for just a few surface scratches. There's a few surface scratches here, right behind the drive box location. And that's really the worst of it for the entire boat here. So that is the cumulative wear of about 90 launches and landings, where we were dragging this up and down every surface except for sharp rocks and exposed coral. And as far as what the ultimate lifespan of this skin would be, I would suspect, based on what I'm seeing here, that we could do this same trip 3 more times exactly the same way before we had to take the skin off and put a new one back on. And if we were willing to take a little bit better care of it, and especially if the boat wasn't really heavily loaded, so we could carry it down to the water, we could easily get 2 or even 3 or 4 times more life out of it. So it's not indestructible, and the skin will wear out eventually, but generally speaking, people get at least 5 years out of one of these skins, and I've seen people go as far as 15 years before they have to reskin it. Now, if you're wondering how much work that is, reskinning takes about 3 days of your time and costs about $250 in materials for a canoe this size to put a new skin on. So it's definitely a little bit time consuming, but it's not the end of the world. All right, so turning the boat back upright, I think the worst wear on this entire canoe is really just the insides and the tops of these gunnels right here. So coming in really close here, I think the worst spot I can see is right here where the gunnel was sitting right on top of my roof rack. And this is entirely my fault because I didn't put any padding on top of my roof racks. Then I strapped the boat down, drove 3,000 miles and went on a bunch of 4-wheel drive roads. And surprise, surprise, I ended up getting a little bit of wear right here. So if you just ignore my gross negligence, I would say over here is kind of the worst spots of the wear along the gunnels here. You can see where just a tiny little bit of the cedar is peeled off, and there's definitely some denting along the top of the gunnels. And a lot of this just has to do with my choice to use Western red cedar for the entire gunnel lamination. So if you were to use pine or spruce or fir for this, it would definitely be a little bit more resistant to getting banged up. But for me personally, with my injuries, it's more important that the canoe be as light as possible. And this isn't really a structural concern. This is just purely aesthetic. Now, taking a look at the ribs and stringers, there's no real surprises here. The ribs look fine, the stringers look fine, the lashings look good. It's definitely a bit dirty from all the gunk and the fish blood that was down there, but other than that, things look really well. The only structural failure that I've seen is I've got a little bit of delamination going on this reinforced rib right here, which is epoxied down to the rib below it. And this isn't actually part of the normal canoe system. This is just something I do to stabilize the pedal drive attachment. So if you don't have a pedal drive canoe, you don't have to worry about this. Now, speaking of the pedal drive, I'm going to be covering that in detail in the next video, but I just thought I'd give you a quick glance at what the attachment point looks like. We've got this plywood plate here, which is deeply integrated into the frame and laminated to the skin. And this can be used either with a cap that can get screwed down to just use this like a normal canoe with nothing in the way, or we've got the pedal drive adapter box that allows you to use a variety of different flipper drives that use the Hobie Mirage geometry. All right, so I think this is as good a time as any to show you guys the results of that experiment I talked about earlier, where we covered one half of the bottom of the canoe with a mat, and then we left the other half of the canoe completely uncovered for the entire trip. And the main reason I did this experiment is because a lot of times people are nervous about a boat being held together with lashings, and especially with continuous lashings, people are concerned that these lashings could break and start to unravel. And having built and used these skin boats for over 20 years, I'm not concerned about that, but I feel like nothing reassures people more than a scientific experiment. So why don't we just grab the camera real quick here. So this is the end of the boat that had the mat covering it the whole time. You can see that these lashings are in really good shape. I mean, there's just no damage to the cord at all. Once again, this is a heavy waxed polyester, and this is a cord that we have specially made for us. It's heavier than the normal artificial sinew that you get. You can buy this in our store if you want. So these lashings look just fine. This keel is spruce, by the way. I forgot to mention that earlier. And then if we take a look at that same location right in front of the seat on the other end of the canoe where there wasn't a mat, you can see that these lashings aren't looking so good. They are definitely abraded. There's some fuzzy spots. But what's most surprising to me is that even with us walking directly on top of these and fishing and everything else that happens in a boat over months and months, no individual lashing is abraded more than 50% of the way through. And that compares to the wood right here. Look at this. This is just the wood on the keel right here. This is Sitka spruce, and this is worn down a lot more than the lashing itself. So obviously you don't want to treat your canoe this way. You want to cover up the lashings, but this does demonstrate the strength of the material. Also, it's worth noting that because the skin is effectively glued to the frame, if you were to cut any of these lashings, they can't actually unravel. And also remember, this is the worst spot. So if we come back and around the seat right here to where there also wasn't a mat, but we were using this as a storage compartment, you can see all these lashings are just fine. Now, as long as we're talking about the floor mat, I just want to address this really quick because I get asked a lot, why don't I put floorboards in the bottom of my canoes? And the reason for that is, one, it just adds unnecessary weight, but even more importantly, skin boats are already disadvantaged because the framework is taking up some of the vertical height in the bottom of the canoe, which makes the sitting geometry less comfortable and also gives you less room for your feet if you're someone who likes to kneel in your canoe. And if you add floorboards on top of that, you're making that problem even worse. Whereas if you just put a mat on top of it like this, your feet or your knees are actually going to sink down into the mat a little bit between the spaces in the framework, which is effectively going to put the floor height more like where it would be in a normal canoe. And so in the case of my canoes, I don't think that floorboards make sense. Some of the lighter framed skin-on frame canoes actually require them for structural reasons, but for me, this mat is more than comfortable. And all of my students who haven't believed me and have put floorboards inside their boat and then also tried the mat have gotten rid of the floorboards and just stuck with the mat. Now, coming in really close on the end of the canoe here, just a minor thing that I was testing on this trip was the fasteners for this pad eye that I spec in the plans. And generally this is used as an attachment point for a grab loop or a tow line. And we also use it as a fair lead for the halyard on the sail. And the thing that concerns me about this is that the only thing holding this on is 2 number 6 screws that are screwed down into the end grain of the stem. And I've always wondered if with enough abuse this would start to work its way loose. Man, this was a great chance to figure that out because I've got Western red cedar stems on this, which are going to be the least strong wood I would recommend. And so I've just got my normal fasteners going down into here, and I had this tied down and tightened down as the bow rope on the front of my Jeep for literally thousands of miles of driving and jerking and jumping around. And then we use this a lot to carry the canoe and drag the canoe. And there is no movement at all in these fasteners. So pretty happy with my recommendation there. I feel like this is solid. Now, one more small detail I want to mention is the Total Boat water-based varnish that I use to coat the seats, the outrigger boards, the drive box, and the rub rails. And I've never used this stuff before, so I didn't know what to expect, but I have to say, after letting this sit out in direct sunlight for 4.5 months in Mexico, this varnish more than proved itself. It's definitely not the smoothest or the prettiest varnish out there, but the lack of toxicity combined with the ease of application more than makes up for that in my mind, and I'm definitely going to be using this stuff going forward. All right, so I think that's pretty much it for the durability and the construction details. Now let's talk about the Canoe Performance. And like I said in the beginning, I don't normally build hybrid tandem solo boats because they don't do either task very well, and this boat was definitely no different. So in tandem mode with about 350 pounds of people and gear on board, I felt like I wanted just a little bit more stability and about a 1/2 inch more freeboard, which really limited our non-outrigger paddling to the trips that we did in the mangrove estuaries. I mean, I never felt like we were gonna tip over, but for open water, I really wanna see a boat like this be about 2 inches wider and about 5 inches longer. Also, because I biased the seating location so I could use it better as a solo canoe, it sat a little bit too deep in the stern when using it as a tandem, which isn't a huge deal with the pedal drive, but for any type of normal canoeing, you have a lot better control if the boat is balanced correctly on the water. Although on the other hand, it's pretty easy to shift your gear a little bit to solve any issues with trim. Also, because the boat was a little bit undersized, we had to be more careful choosing conditions because in a really steep chop, this boat could take a wave over the bow. Now, thinking about this from a solo canoe perspective, I have to admit that I barely paddled this as a solo with just a canoe paddle because I already know that this boat is way too big for me, but I have used it a lot as a solo with the pedal drive, and in that case, it's pretty much the opposite of the tandem. It sits too high in the water, which does a great job for keeping waves out, but also makes it really challenging to control in windy conditions. Another issue with the tandem solo concept is that even the best compromised seating position still puts the paddler too far back in both solo and tandem mode. So when I was out solo, I always had to put a bucket of water in front of me to help with the balance, although that's not a big deal because I'd like to have a bucket of water with me usually when I'm fishing. Now, the side-to-side stability, on the other hand, was actually really nice for fishing. So if I was going to be using this just with the pedal drive, I would not hesitate to build another wide solo, but I would make it about a foot shorter and I would move the paddler towards the center of the boat. And then, of course, if I wasn't going to be using a pedal drive at all, I would just follow my normal solo canoe sizing recommendations, which are based on paddler weight. So I guess for me, the only real surprise that came from the canoe part of this canoe testing was how well the coating held up. I thought there would be a lot more abrasion and I thought there would be a lot more UV damage. Now, as far as what to expect next for this design, I'm hoping that if I can get my other work done this summer, I can find some time to build a dedicated tandem fishing canoe based on everything I learned this time. And of course, if that happens, I'll share it with you. Now, one last thing I want to mention before I forget here is that I've gotten a few comments on my Baja fishing videos asking about how the sail worked out in Baja. And if you don't know what that is, basically we just have a really simple pop-up sail that's included in our normal canoe building course, and you can see that in a bunch of other videos. And I've got to be honest, we did bring a sail down with us, but we only used it twice because most of the time we were out fishing, and if you hook into a big mahi or a big bonito with a sail up in a canoe, that is just a great recipe for an unpleasant capsize situation. So really, the only thing I have to report from the sailing system is that for this particular boat, I used some cleats that mount to the inside of the gunnel instead of the ones I normally put on top of the gunnel, which is nice because it keeps the top of the gunnels clear for certain strokes where you're dragging your knuckles along the gunnel or when you're sliding it up onto the roof rack, although it wouldn't work with some of our nesting canoe configurations. So I think that's pretty much it for this video. Thanks for sticking with me. Stay tuned for the next 2 episodes in this series. We're going to be talking about how the pedal drive system performed, and then after that, I'm going to show you the brand new inflatable outrigger that I designed for this trip. In the meantime, if you like this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button, and click the notification bell if you want to stay up to date on all of my crazy skin-on-frame design experiments. You can also find us on our website at capefalconkayaks.com, where we have skin-on-frame building video courses, plan sets, and various free skin-on-frame resources. You can also find us on Instagram at Cape Falcon Builds, where we publish photos and videos of whatever we're working on in the shop or whatever we're testing out on the water, and you can find that same content on the Cape Falcon Kayak Facebook page as well. So that's it for now. Take care, be safe on the water, have fun building your skin boat.